quiet welcome to Plotful. Let's journey together into the often overlooked details surrounding the daily life of a soldier in Napoleon's army. Before we begin, if you find value in these stories, perhaps take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps others find the channel. You can also let me know in the comments where you're listening from and the time. It's always fascinating to see our quiet community grow around the world. Now, find a comfortable position. Perhaps dim the lights or turn on a soft fan for background noise. And let's ease into tonight's story together. The change, when it came, often announced itself with a sound, slicing through the familiar hum of daily life. Imagine the air, thick with the scent of wood smoke or damp earth, suddenly pierced by the distant rhythmic tattoo of a drum. Not the cheerful beat of a village festival, but something more insistent, a measured pulse growing steadily louder as it neared your quiet hamlet or bustling town square. This was the sound of the recruiter, his polished buttons and promises of glory, a stark contrast to the muddy lanes and the often weary faces of those who watched him pass. Perhaps it wasn't a drum that shattered your peace, but the reedy voice of the town crier, his pronouncements usually about market days or lost sheep, now carrying a heavier burden. You might hear him from your window or across the field, his words echoing faintly, listing names of your neighbors, your friends, perhaps even your own. Or maybe it was simply a piece of paper, a formal notice of conscription, nailed starkly to the church door or the wall of the mayor's office. The ink, still fresh or slightly blurred by a recent rain, would spell out the emperor's demand, a silent, undeniable summons. To see your name, or that of a loved one on such a list, it was a moment where the grand sweep of history, Napoleon's vast ambitions, reached down and touched your small, individual life. The rough texture of the paper, the official stamp, the impersonal script, all these small details would mark the end of one path and the forced beginning of another, a journey into a world of marching, cannons, and uncertain tomorrows. The fields you knew, the familiar faces, would soon become memories, replaced by the churn of the Grande Armée. The fields you knew, the familiar faces, would soon become memories, replaced by the churn of the Grande Armée. For many, of course, there was no real choice. The summons had arrived, that stark piece of paper, a decree from a distant, powerful will. Yet, even within this vast machine of conscription, and for those who volunteered before the net closed around them, the reasons for marching under Napoleon's eagles were as varied as the landscapes they would soon traverse. What strange alchemy of hope, desperation, or duty pulled them from their homes? Imagine, for a moment, the biting wind whistling through the ill-fitting door of a peasant's hovel, the gnawing emptiness in your belly a constant companion. The army, with its promise of rough wool uniforms, however itchy, and a daily, if often meager, ration of bread and soupy stew, might have seemed a desperate escape, a brutal exchange perhaps, trading the slow decay of poverty for the swift violence of the battlefield, but one that countless young men felt compelled to make. The smell of damp earth and animal dung replaced by gunpowder and the metallic tang of fear, and sometimes blood. Then there was the siren song of La Gloire, the glory of France. Napoleon, a master of image, painted visions of triumph, of a new world forged by French valor. For some, the idea of being part of this grand, thundering adventure, of perhaps earning a gleaming medal, or simply the respect of their peers, was an irresistible pull. They pictured themselves heroes, striding through cheering towns, unaware that the cheers might be fleeting, the victories costly. It was a potent dream, woven from propaganda and youthful yearning, a stark contrast to a future spent toiling in an unyielding field. But that potent dream, however bright, had a cost, and its first installment was paid at the moment of departure. Picture it. The rough-hewn timber of the cottage door, perhaps still damp with morning dew, a final anchor to the life you've always known. Your mother's hand, calloused from years of work, might have pressed a small, clumsily wrapped parcel of bread and perhaps a sliver of cheese into yours, her eyes betraying a fear she tried to hide with a brave, trembling smile. The scent of wood smoke from the hearth, a smell so familiar it was almost part of your own breath, would soon be replaced by the dust of the road and the unfamiliar tang of 1,000 marching men. Younger siblings might cling to your legs, their faces tear-streaked and uncomprehending, their small voices piping questions you couldn't quite bring yourself to answer. Or perhaps it was a quieter, more somber farewell in the village square. A collective grief hanging heavy in the cool air, as sons and brothers turned their backs on everything they held dear. The familiar cobblestones beneath your ill-fitting boots, the crooked steeple of the village church silhouetted against a pale sky, the faces of neighbors etched with worry. These were the last comforts, soon to become just cherished, aching memories. As you marched, each step took you further from that embrace. The sounds of home, a barking dog, a distant church bell, fading into the rhythmic trudge of boots and the creak of leather. The road ahead was a ribbon of uncertainty, unspooling towards a future painted in glory, but paved with this profound, quiet loss. The ribbon of uncertainty, the road you've trod for what feels like an eternity, finally unspools. Not into the gleaming halls of glory you might have pictured, but into a sprawling, chaotic city of canvas and men. This is the depot, or perhaps a staging encampment, and it's a bewildering assault on your senses. Imagine stepping from the quiet solitude of the march into a human anthill, teeming and thrumming with a life utterly alien to your own. A world transformed in an instant. A bewildering symphony of noise greets you first. Shouts in harsh, unfamiliar dialects and foreign tongues bounce off the tightly packed tents. A constant babble that never quite resolves into sense. There's the rhythmic clang of a far-off blacksmith's hammer shaping metal, the nervous whinny of countless unseen horses, the occasional bleating of sheep destined for the stew pot. And underlying it all, the incessant, slightly off-key thrum of practice drums. A heartbeat for this new, enormous beast. The air itself is thick, a potent, almost visible stew of wood smoke from 1,000 tiny fires. The sour tang of stale sweat from unwashed bodies. The earthy aroma of horses and worn leather. And perhaps, if the wind is kind, a faint, tantalizing hint of something vaguely edible cooking. Faces blur past, a sea of strangers in various states of uniform, some threadbare, some surprisingly new, none familiar, none offering a moment of recognition. You are a single, insignificant speck in this vast, churning machine, your name, your village, your previous life already feeling like a half-forgotten dream, hazy and distant. Almost immediately, the impersonal nature of this new world asserts itself. Orders are barked, not requested. Echoing across the makeshift avenues, you're jostled into a line for a thin, scratchy blanket, perhaps a hunk of bread so hard it could stun an ox. This is it, the first, jarring taste of army routine, the beginning of a life measured not by seasons or the sun's gentle arc, but by shrill bugle calls and the rasping voice of a corporal. The glory? That feels very distant indeed, swallowed by the immediate, overwhelming present. Beyond the rough wool of your blanket and the unyielding hardness of the ground beneath you, another layer of this new, bewildering life begins to unfold. It's not just the sharp, barked orders you struggle to decipher. It's the sheer, bewildering chorus of voices that rises and falls around the flickering campfires. You settle down for the night, and perhaps to your left a group of Italians, their faces animated in the firelight, share a thin whine and gesticulate with expressive hands, their words a rapid, musical flow. To your right, a pair of stoic Poles, their greatcoats pulled tight, murmur in a language that sounds to your ears like rustling autumn leaves and sharp, unfamiliar consonants. You might catch snippets of guttural German, the flatter tones of Dutch, maybe even a dialect from some tiny Swiss mountain valley you've never even heard of. These aren't just different accents. They are entirely different worlds colliding, each man carrying the subtle scent of his distant homeland, be it the lingering aroma of peat smoke from an Irish hearth, or the dusty memory of sun-baked earth from a Spanish village, now mingling with the pervasive miasma of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and damp wool. Imagine the shared confusion, the tentative gestures, the hesitant smiles that try to bridge the vast linguistic chasms. An offered piece of stale, gritty bread, a clumsy attempt to help mend a tear in another's tunic, a silent nod of weary understanding over a poorly translated joke. These become the fragile, yet surprisingly strong threads of an unlikely connection. It's a strange sort of family, this Grande Armée, a tapestry woven from 100 different threads, bound not by blood, but by the shared mud, the gnawing hunger, and the distant, often incomprehensible promise of an emperor's vision. How quickly the familiar comfort of your own village, your own tongue, your mother's cooking, must have faded, replaced by this vast, uncertain, and undeniably vibrant human landscape. And amidst this vast, shifting sea of humanity, one thing provides a stark, immediate sense of identity: your uniform, that deep, almost luminous blue of the coat, the crisp white of the breeches and waistcoat, perhaps the vibrant red facings that declare your regiment to the world. It's a splash of ordered color against the often drab backdrop of the campaign trail, a visual promise of discipline and might. When you first struggled into its stiff embrace, perhaps a surge of pride swelled in your chest. This wasn't just clothing, it was a declaration. You were a soldier of France, a cog in the emperor's grand machine, instantly recognizable, instantly belonging. But that pride, like the fleeting shine on your brass buttons, needs constant, weary tending, and often comes at a significant cost. The wool, thick and unforgivingly coarse, designed more for crisp parade grounds than for slogging through summer mud or shivering in the biting winds of a Russian winter. Imagine the incessant scratch of it against your skin, day after day, often damp from rain or sweat, carrying the faint, persistent aroma of unwashed bodies and old wood smoke. It's rarely truly clean, rarely truly comfortable. Perhaps yours is a size too large, bunching awkwardly, or a size too small, constricting your every breath. The tall shako, that iconic bearskin or felted headdress, might look magnificent from afar, but it's a heavy, awkward burden, offering little real protection and catching the wind like a poorly rigged sail. And keeping it all presentable, that's another daily battle, waged with threadbare brushes, precious water, and dwindling polish, often by the dim light of a flickering campfire, under the watchful, critical eye of a sergeant who cares more for appearances than for your aching shoulders or chapped hands. A symbol of glory, yes, but also a constant, itchy, and remarkably heavy reminder of your unyielding duty. That unyielding duty offers little respite, even in the deepest hours of the night. Sleep, when it comes, is often a fleeting, shallow thing, snatched on damp ground, amidst the symphony of 1,000 snoring comrades. And then, all too soon, before the first hint of gray light even touches the eastern sky, the day asserts itself with brutal punctuality. A single piercing note from a bugle, or the sharp, insistent tattoo of a drum, rips through the pre-dawn stillness. It's the asterisk ravenif, a sound designed not to soothe but to command, slicing through the clinging tendrils of morning mist and the lingering dreams of exhausted men. Imagine the air, cold and heavy in your lungs, carrying that sound across the sprawling, sleeping giant of the camp. Slowly, reluctantly, the army stirs. Figures begin to emerge from beneath threadbare blankets and makeshift shelters, shadows moving in the dim, uncertain light. A cough here, a muttered curse there, the clink of metal as someone reaches for their gear. The ground beneath is likely cold, perhaps muddy, and the air is thick with the smell of damp wool, stale campfire smoke, and the undeniable aroma of thousands of unwashed bodies packed closely together. There's no gentle rousing, no quiet contemplation of the dawn, just the stark, metallic call to begin again. Another day in the service of the emperor, whatever it might bring. The first sliver of dawn, a reluctant, cold gray, seeps through the oiled canvas of your tent, shared with half a dozen other snoring, grumbling forms. Your first conscious thought is likely of the persistent, maddening itch. The lice, tiny, unwelcome guests, feasting merrily in the seams of your coarse, perpetually damp wool uniform. Hygiene, as we might picture it, is a forgotten luxury, a civilian dream. Here, in the sprawling, chaotic camp, it's a gritty, hurried affair, a brief, often futile skirmish against the grime. If you're fortunate, and the camp isn't on the move again, there might be a communal trough, or perhaps a sluggish stream nearby. Its water, you can be sure, will be a murky, chilling soup, clouded with the sediment stirred by countless men and the waste of equally thirsty horses. You'd splash this frigid, dubious liquid onto your face, rubbing away the worst of yesterday's sweat and mud with a calloused hand, or perhaps a worn scrap of linen, if such a treasure hasn't been lost or bartered away. Soap? A precious commodity, more likely to be found in an officer's kit than a private's haversack. Shaving, if attempted at all, would be with a shared, brutally blunt razor, a testament more to grim determination than to any desire for a smooth chin. The air itself hangs heavy with the mingling sense of unwashed humanity, damp wool, old leather, distant latrines, and the ever-present wood smoke. It's a constant, quiet battle, this pursuit of cleanliness, one usually lost before it truly begins. A small, daily surrender to the overwhelming realities of life on campaign. Beyond these small, often lost battles for personal comfort, loomed a far more demanding daily ritual, one intimately tied to survival itself. Your constant companion, heavier than any regret, was the Charleville musket. Its smooth, worn wooden stock and cold, unforgiving steel barrel became extensions of your own arm, your own will. Hours, stretching into what felt like an eternity, were spent learning its secrets, its every metallic sigh and stubborn click. This wasn't just about pointing and shooting. It was a precise, almost balletic sequence of movements, drilled into muscle memory until you could perform it blindfolded, half asleep, or amidst the terrifying cacophony of battle. Imagine the ritual, the tear of the paper cartridge with your teeth, the sharp, slightly acrid taste of black powder on your tongue, the careful pour down the barrel, followed by the wadded ball. Then the rhythmic clang of the ramrod, its metallic song against the barrel, pushing, seating, a sound that would become as familiar as your own heartbeat. A dull percussion against the vast silence of the early morning drill field. Finally, the heavy lift. The alignment of crude sights on a distant, often theoretical, foe. The squeeze of the trigger. The almost prayerful pause before the flint struck steel. Then, the sudden, violent bloom of orange fire. The deafening roar, and the bruising kick against your shoulder. A harsh reminder of its power. A cloud of acrid, sulphurous smoke would momentarily obscure your vision, stinging your eyes and nostrils, a temporary, personal fog of war. This intricate dance, this noisy, violent craft, meticulously broken down into 12, sometimes 15 distinct steps, was your lifeline. Mastering it, ensuring each movement was performed flawlessly under immense pressure, was not a matter of pride, but of grim, stark necessity. Beyond the musket, though, beyond that intimate, fiery ritual, lay the vast, open canvas of the parade ground. Here, the individual movements of loading and firing were woven into a much larger, more complex tapestry of discipline. Day after day, under the watchful, often harsh, eyes of sergeants and corporals, you would find yourself immersed in the rhythm of the drill. The sun might beat down, baking the packed earth until dust rose with every synchronized step, or perhaps a cold, persistent rain would soak your wool uniform, making it heavy and clammy against your skin. The commands, sharp and distinct, would echo across the field, a constant, guiding percussion. March. Halt. Wheel left. Form square. Each maneuver, practiced 1,000 times, was designed to transform a collection of men, farmers, laborers, perhaps a few dreamers, into a single, unthinking, perfectly responsive entity. You'd feel the dull ache in your shoulders from the musket's weight, the weariness in your legs from hours of standing, marching, turning, the sound of hundreds of boots striking the ground in unison, the precise click of bayonets being fixed, the rustle of wool and leather. These became the mundane soundtrack to an extraordinary transformation. It was a relentless, grinding process, this forging of the Grande Armée, one footfall, one perfectly executed turn at a time. And with that relentless grinding, that forging of a unified whole, came an equally relentless web of rules. It wasn't simply about the crispness of your salute or the angle of your bayonet. Military law in Napoleon's Grande Armée was an ever-present shadow, dictating the rhythm of almost every waking moment, and many of the sleeping ones too. Imagine it clinging to your uniform, a silent, stern observer. Perhaps you've neglected to properly polish the brass buttons on your tunic, their gleam dulled by dust and wear. For such a minor oversight, you might find yourself with the unenviable task of extra sentry duty on a biting night, or assigned to the fragrant realities of latrine cleaning. The air, thick and heavy. These were the relatively gentle nudges back into line. For matters considered more grave, the desperate theft of a comrade's meager rations, the whispered thought of desertion finding feet, or the stark, unthinkable act of striking an officer. The consequences were terrifyingly immediate. The hollow thud of the drum assembling men for a court-martial could curdle the stew in your stomach, a sound that promised little comfort. The stark silhouette of a hastily constructed gallows against a dawn sky or the grim formation of a firing squad were potent, silent lecturers in obedience. There was precious little space for leniency, even less for a soft heart. Order was the god of this new world, and fear, it often seemed, was its most diligent apostle. It was a heavy, scratchy blanket, this system, ensuring that the individual spirit bent always to the collective will, a constant, dull pressure. But even under such a heavy sky, the stomach still rumbled, a reminder of more basic, insistent needs than even the most rigid discipline. The constant, dull pressure of army life found its echo in the daily fare, most notably, la soupe. This wasn't a meal you'd write home about, assuming you had a home left to write to, or the inclination. Imagine, if you will, a vast communal cauldron, steam rising in the cool air, carrying a scent that was more necessity than temptation. The contents were a lottery, dictated by what the foragers had scrounged or liberated that day. Sometimes it was a thin, watery broth, specked with whatever greens could be found, maybe a few lonely beans swimming in the depths. Other times, if fortune smiled, it might be thicker, a stew of sorts, perhaps with a chunk of tough boiled beef or a sliver of fatty pork, the kind of meal that sticks to your ribs for a few precious hours. You'd dip your tin cup in, the metal clanking, the atmosphere thick with the quiet murmurs of tired men. Alongside this centerpiece was the bread, dark, dense, and often jaw-achingly hard. This wasn't the crusty, airy delight of a village baker. This was campaign bread, baked to last and often tasting like it. You'd tear off chunks, sometimes gnawing at them, other times softening them in the soup until they became a sodden, palatable mass. And to wash it all down? Perhaps a ration of thin, sour wine, or if the quartermaster was generous, a fiery sip of brandy. A small, burning comfort against the chill of the evening and the uncertainties of tomorrow. With the last morsel swallowed and the small fire beginning to dim, thoughts would inevitably turn to rest, such as it was. If fortune smiled, your night might be spent in a garrison barracks. Imagine rows upon rows of rough-hewn wooden bunks, perhaps 2 or 3 tiers high, crammed into a long, echoing room. The air would be thick with the mingled scents of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and the faint, earthy smell of stale straw from countless thin mattresses. Sleep here was a communal affair, punctuated by the unconscious symphony of snores, coughs, and the occasional muttered nightmare from the men packed in around you, a shared exhalation of the day's weariness. More often, especially on the march, your shelter was canvas. 6 of you, perhaps more, would huddle together in a simple tent, its fabric offering a thin shield against the biting wind and persistent rain. You'd lie shoulder to shoulder, the ground beneath often damp and stubbornly cold, seeking what little warmth you could from your comrades. The canvas would flap and sigh in the night breeze, a constant soft percussion against the darkness, and outside, the hushed sounds of the camp. The distant rhythmic tread of a sentry, the soft whicker of a horse, would drift in, subtle reminders of the vast, slumbering army that surrounded you. And then there were the nights with no roof at all, just the vast, indifferent sky stretching above. In a hasty bivouac, you might simply wrap yourself as tightly as possible in your greatcoat and lie upon the earth, your knapsack serving as a meager pillow. The ground could be cold, hard, or sodden with mud, but you'd search for the driest, most sheltered spot available, perhaps near the fading embers of a dying fire. Here, under the silent, distant gaze of the stars, the chill would slowly seep into your bones, and the only real comfort was the shared breath of the men huddled close by, a fragile human warmth against the immensity of the night. That fragile human warmth, however, was the seed from which something surprisingly strong could grow. In the harsh school of war, where life was cheap and comforts few, the men around you became more than just companions in misery. They became your asterisk escouade, your mess, a tiny, fiercely loyal band of brothers, typically numbering just a handful of souls, perhaps 6 to 12 men. This was your new family, forged not of blood, but of shared hunger, freezing nights, and the constant, gnawing presence of danger. Together you would pool your meager rations. Imagine the scene, huddled around a sputtering fire, one man stirring a pot of thin, watery soup, perhaps with a hoarded onion or a scrounged turnip floating hopefully within. The smell wouldn't be gourmet, a faint earthy aroma mixed with wood smoke and damp wool, but it was the smell of survival, of community. You'd share the same battered cooking pot, dip your coarse bread into the same communal broth, and grumble about the same incompetent quartermasters or the endless marching. These small, repeated rituals, day after grueling day, wove an invisible thread between you. These were the men who knew your deepest fears without you uttering a word, who would share their last crust of bread, or offer a swig from their canteen when your own was dry. They'd seen you at your worst, caked in mud and sweat, perhaps shivering with fever, and at your most vulnerable, maybe staring blankly after a near miss. Loyalty within the mess was often absolute, a shield against the vast indifference of the war machine and the loneliness of the campaign. In this tightly knit circle, amidst the squalor and the dread, you found a flicker of humanity, a reason to keep placing one foot in front of the other, even when everything else seemed utterly lost. And so, when the marching stopped at least for a while, and the gnawing fear receded to a dull ache, you might find yourself with a precious hour or two. Perhaps you'd pull out a needle, its eye frustratingly small in the dim light of a sputtering candle or the dying embers of the campfire. Your fingers, rough and calloused, would clumsily guide the thread through the coarse wool of your tunic, patching yet another hole torn by brambles or a stray spark. This wasn't skilled tailoring. It was a desperate act of preservation, trying to keep the biting wind or the ceaseless rain from seeping directly to your skin. Or maybe, if you were lucky enough to have scrounged some ink and a precious scrap of paper, you'd try to write home. What could you even say? The words would feel heavy, inadequate, struggling to convey the brutal truths or the profound weariness without causing too much alarm back in your quiet village. Often it was easier to simply say you were well, that the food was tolerable, and that you thought of them always. Each crossed letter was a fragile bridge to a world you weren't sure you'd ever see again. As the light faded further, the murmur of voices might rise around the fires, weaving through the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. A familiar tune, perhaps a love song from a distant province, or a boisterous drinking ditty, sung with more enthusiasm than skill, the harmonies a little ragged but undeniably heartfelt. Nearby, a worn deck of cards might appear, the ink faded, the edges softened by countless hands. They'd be dealt out on an overturned drum or a relatively flat patch of ground. A few copper coins might change hands, but mostly it was for the distraction, a small, shared ritual to ward off the encroaching darkness, both literal and metaphorical. Those few copper coins, passing from one calloused hand to another around the fire, were often the only currency seen for weeks, sometimes months. Official pay, when it did arrive, felt more like a rumor whispered down the ranks than a reliable wage. The intricate lumbering machinery of the army's bureaucracy meant that pay was perpetually delayed, caught somewhere in the cogs between Paris and the front lines, leaving pockets disconcertingly light. A soldier's loyalty was often tested not just by cannon fire, but by an empty stomach and the gnawing uncertainty of when, or if, his dues would ever materialize. Imagine the scene when the paymaster finally did appear, perhaps with a small, heavily guarded chest. The relief, quickly followed by a resigned sigh. The sum, often a mere handful of sous or francs, would feel impossibly small for the blood and sweat expended. What could it buy? Perhaps a momentary escape in a measure of thin, sour wine from a camp follower, a luxury compared to the usual water, or a small twist of tobacco, its sharp scent, a brief personal comfort amidst the communal smells of unwashed bodies and simmering stew. Sometimes, a soldier might indulge in a sliver of hard, salty cheese, or a piece of fruit if they were lucky enough to be near a town not yet picked clean. More often than not, though, this meager reward would be carefully hoarded, or perhaps risked in another hopeful game of cards, chasing the illusion of a slightly better tomorrow. It was a fleeting acknowledgment, those few coins, easily lost, quickly spent, a scant and often bitter tally for a life lived on the very edge of existence, marching to the drumbeat of an empire. That drumbeat, sometimes a distant, almost soothing pulse in the life of the camp, could suddenly quicken, shatter the fragile illusion of peace. One moment, you might be nursing a thin, sour wine, the taste clinging to your tongue, or carefully mending a torn gaiter with clumsy, cold, stiffened fingers. The smell of damp wool and old sweat, a constant, almost comforting companion in its familiarity. Perhaps you were simply lost in a moment of quiet reflection, staring into the dying embers of a small fire, the low murmur of 1,000 sleeping men, a strange sort of lullaby, the next a sharp guttural cry, "Aux armes!" Or perhaps the urgent, insistent call of a bugle, its brassy notes slicing through the air, a sound that cut deeper than any chill morning mist, jarring you awake, heart suddenly pounding against your ribs. There was rarely much warning. The orders would ripple through the ranks like a sudden gust of wind, carried by sergeants with voices hoarse from shouting over the din of thousands of men and startled beasts. The relative predictability, such as it was, would vanish like smoke from a snuffed-out candle. Suddenly, the air thrummed with a different, almost frantic energy. A hurried packing of meager belongings, the few treasures of a soldier's life thrust into worn knapsacks. Canvas tents collapsing with a sigh, the clatter of cookpots hastily stowed, the rhythmic thud of musket butts on the packed earth as formations began to coalesce in the dim, uncertain light of dawn or dusk. You'd feel that familiar knot in your stomach, a cold, heavy companion that could be either dread for the unknown, muddy road ahead, or a grim sort of anticipation for, well, for whatever fresh hell or fleeting glory came next. The subtle scent of fear, barely perceptible, might mingle with the lingering wood smoke and the damp earth beneath your worn boots. "En route!" the cry would go up, echoing down the assembling columns, and just like that, your world shrank to the sight of the dusty, patched-up coat of the man in front, and the endless, ribboning road stretching out into profound uncertainty. The march had begun, and as that march began, so too did the intimate, often agonizing, relationship with the weight on your back. This wasn't just a bag. It was your world condensed, your survival kit, your constant, heavy companion, the haversack asterisk. Imagine its rough canvas, or perhaps stiff, treated cowhide pressing into your shoulders, a familiar ache that would soon settle into a dull, persistent throb over the endless winding miles. It's a sensation that rarely truly leaves, a memory etched deep into muscle and bone, long after the straps are unbuckled for the night. Inside this cumbersome satchel, each item added its own specific gravity to the load. The Charleville musket, a formidable piece of nearly 10 pounds of polished wood and cold steel, even before you consider the long, wicked-looking bayonet, was often slung, but its presence, its potential, was always felt. Then, the 60 rounds of ammunition, dense lead balls and fragile paper cartridges, tucked securely into the asterisk gibron, the stiff leather cartridge box, adding another solid, unyielding lump of weight against your hip or back. Your meager rations, perhaps a substantial chunk of coarse, dark bread, already stale and hard enough to crack a tooth, maybe a sliver of stringy, heavily salted dried meat if you were fortunate, smelling faintly of old smoke and the provision sack it shared space with. A thin, rolled woolen blanket, often damp from the morning dew or a sudden downpour, offered scant comfort against the cold, unforgiving ground that would serve as your bed. And perhaps, tucked away in a quiet corner, a small, treasured personal item, a creased and reread letter from a sweetheart, a roughly carved wooden token from a younger sibling, a tiny, tarnished locket holding a miniature portrait, a whisper of a life left far, far behind, its emotional weight somehow far exceeding its physical ounces. All of this, a burden of some 50 or 60 pounds, sometimes even more, a small, personal mountain you carried day after day, towards an ever-receding, unknown horizon. Each step, a testament to human endurance. That personal mountain, your constant companion, now moved with you, one step at a time, onto the endless road. These weren't the smooth, paved highways of a later age, oh no. More often, you found yourself on what could charitably be called a track. A ribbon of churned earth, stretching across the vast European landscape, a testament to the passage of countless armies before yours. In the dry, scorching summers, it was a place of choking, relentless dust. A fine, gritty powder thrown up by thousands of marching feet, by the iron-rimmed wheels of artillery caissons and supply wagons. It coated your blue uniform, turning it a ghostly gray, settled in your hair, your eyebrows, a persistent grit between your teeth, a constant, irritating presence in your stinging eyes. The sun beat down, the air thick and shimmering, each breath drawing in more of that parched earth. Thirst became a familiar, dull ache in your throat. Then came the rains. And with the rains, the mud. This wasn't just a bit of damp earth. This was often a thick, greedy, boot-sucking mire. Imagine the ground transformed into a vast, brown, malevolent pudding. Each step a laborious effort as it clung to your worn-out boots, threatening to steal them, weighing down your already weary legs with impossible heaviness. The sound of it, a constant, disheartening squelch and suck, punctuated by the groans of men and the straining of horses. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth, wet wool, and something else, something faintly rotten from the churned-up ground. Sometimes, the mud was knee-deep, a viscous, cold embrace that chilled you to the bone, making progress a slow, agonizing crawl. Each footfall was a gamble, a slippery, uncertain purchase on a hostile, indifferent world. The road, whether baked hard into ruts or dissolved into this clinging slurry, was a relentless adversary, demanding every ounce of your dwindling strength, day after weary day. And when that strength ebbed, as it so often did, another primal need would gnaw at you: hunger. The grand imperial supply trains, those lumbering lifelines, were often more myth than reality on the long, punishing campaigns. Stretched thin across vast distances, or simply swallowed by the same mud that claimed your boots, they frequently failed to appear. So you learned to live off the land, as the saying went. A rather generous term, foraging for what often felt like a desperate scramble, a polite veil drawn over a grim necessity. You and a few comrades, faces etched with grime and weariness, would peel away from the trudging column, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of sustenance. Imagine spotting a lonely farmhouse, smoke a thin, hopeful wisp from its chimney, or perhaps a cluster of silent stone buildings hunkered low against the wind. Would there be stern, shuttered windows, barricaded doors, or perhaps a wary face, etched with its own hunger, peering out? The air might carry the faint, almost forgotten scent of wood smoke, or perhaps just the damp earth and the metallic tang of your own fear and anticipation. Sometimes, a door would open to a shared crust, a few hoarded vegetables given with a sigh that spoke volumes. Other times the transaction was less an offering and more a reluctant surrender, the silence heavy with unspoken resentment. A scrawny chicken, perhaps a single protesting goose, a few handfuls of coarse, gritty flour, or some frostbitten potatoes dug with numb fingers from a half-frozen patch of earth. These were treasures beyond gold. The relief of returning with something, anything, was immense, a brief reprieve from the gnawing emptiness. Yet even then, a quiet shadow might linger, the knowledge that your survival often came at the cost of another's hardship. It was a stark, daily lesson in the brutal arithmetic of war. But even those hard-won scraps, that fleeting moment of warmth in the belly, rarely held the gnawing emptiness at bay for long. That deep, persistent ache was a constant companion, more faithful than any banner, more present than any comrade on those endless, dusty marches. It was a hollow feeling that burrowed into your core, a cold reminder of the body's relentless demands, a sensation that even the deepest sleep struggled to truly soothe. The world, through the eyes of a hungry soldier, became a landscape of potential sustenance or its heartbreaking absence. Thirst, too, was a cruel tormentor. Imagine your throat coated with the fine, gritty dust kicked up by thousands of marching feet, burning with a dryness that no amount of swallowing could ease. Water, when it could be found, was often a murky offering from a roadside ditch, or a hastily scooped handful from a river that had already served countless others upstream. Each sip was a gamble, a desperate hope against the sickness that so often followed. The canteens, when full, felt precious, their contents rationed with a miser's care. And when empty, they were just another dead weight, a hollow echo of a desperate need. When the promised supply wagons failed to appear, as they so often did, a different kind of chill would set in. Hope, already a fragile commodity, would wither a little further. The distant rumble of an empty stomach would become a deafening roar in the quiet desperation of the ranks. Strength, both of body and of spirit, would ebb away like the tide, leaving soldiers to stumble on, fueled by little more than discipline, dwindling hope, and the sheer, stubborn refusal to simply lie down and be forgotten by the side of a foreign road. This constant battle against deprivation was as much a part of their war as any clash of arms. And as if hunger wasn't adversary enough, the very sky above often felt like another enemy. Nature, in its vast indifference, played its own campaigns against these marching columns. Imagine the sun of a Spanish summer, a relentless molten coin burning in a cloudless sky. Dust, fine as milled flour, would rise with every footfall, coating your throat, your eyes, your already sweat-soaked uniform. The heavy wool, a comfort in cooler climes, became a suffocating blanket, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and hot earth. Then, picture the pendulum swing to the other extreme, the infamous Russian winter. A landscape bleached white, stretching to an unforgiving horizon. The cold wasn't just a sensation. It was a presence, seeping into your bones, making your breath crystallize in the air before your face. Fingers, even tucked deep into pockets, would ache with a pain that dulled all other feeling. Snow would fall, sometimes gently, sometimes in a blinding blizzard. Each flake a tiny pinprick of ice against exposed skin, accumulating to bury the dead and weary alike. And between these brutal poles, there was the rain. Not a refreshing shower, but days, sometimes weeks, of relentless, chilling downpour. Your threadbare greatcoat, if you were lucky enough to still possess one, would become a sodden weight, clinging to you, never truly drying. Boots, already cracked and worn, would squelch through an ocean of mud, each step a sucking effort. The world would shrink to a gray, damp misery, the smell of wet wool and mildew a constant companion. These soldiers, with so little true shelter, were utterly at the mercy of the elements, enduring a daily, silent battle against sun, frost, and endless damp, long before they ever saw a battlefield. As the last weak rays of sun bled from the bruised purple of the twilight sky, a collective sigh, almost inaudible beneath the tramping of thousands of feet, would ripple through the column. The order to halt, when it finally came, wasn't a moment of joyous relief, but more like the slumping of a puppet whose strings had just been cut. Every muscle ached, every bone seemed to protest the day's relentless march. Now, with the darkness deepening, began the weary, almost frantic ritual of creating some semblance of a bivouac. You might find yourself, alongside your messmates, desperately scanning the damning landscape for anything that could offer even a sliver of protection. Perhaps a few sparse trees could provide branches to lean together, forming a crude, triangular lean-to. More often it was simply a case of huddling close, your greatcoats pulled tight, using each other as flimsy shields against the encroaching chill. The ground, invariably damp and cold, would offer no welcome, just a hard, unforgiving bed. The air would fill with the low murmur of exhausted men, the clatter of muskets carefully stacked, and perhaps the distant, mournful neigh of a horse. Fires, if permitted and if fuel could be scrounged from the sodden earth or stripped from unwilling trees, would be small, smoky affairs, offering more illusion of warmth than actual comfort. Their flickering light would cast long, dancing shadows, making familiar faces seem alien and gaunt. You'd gnaw on a piece of dry biscuit if you had one, the taste of dust and fatigue mingling in your mouth. Sleep, when it eventually claimed you, wouldn't be a gentle descent, but a heavy fall into a shallow, troubled oblivion, the damp earth already pulling the precious warmth from your bones, promising another cold dawn. But the cold dawn, when it arrived, often brought with it an enemy far more insidious than any bayonet charge or cannon volley. This foe didn't march in formation or wear a bright uniform. It was invisible, a silent, creeping dread. It lurked in the shared, often muddy water source, thrived in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the bivouac, and was carried by the lice that made your threadbare uniform their teeming, unwelcome home. This was the true scourge of Napoleon's armies, claiming far more lives than enemy muskets ever could. Typhus, they sometimes called camp fever, or war fever, for a grimly accurate reason, was a burning sickness that stole your strength, clouded your mind with delirium, and left you shivering uncontrollably even in the stifling summer heat. Then there was dysentery, the dreaded bloody flux, an agonizing and deeply humiliating affliction that reduced proud grenadiers and seasoned veterans alike to weak, dehydrated shells, their insides twisted with relentless cramps. The air around a marching column, already thick with a smell of unwashed bodies, old sweat, and smoky campfires, would become tainted with the unmistakable acrid stench of pervasive sickness. You'd see them day after day, men stumbling out of line, their faces gaunt and pale, glistening with fever, their eyes hollowed out by suffering. They wouldn't often cry out, not in complaint. It was more a quiet fading, a gradual surrender to an enemy they couldn't see or fight. The real battle, for so many, wasn't against the Austrians, the Prussians, or the Russians, but against their own failing bodies, a desperate internal struggle waged in the dirt and squalor of the endless march. More soldiers by far would meet their end this way, not with a glorious bang on the field, but with a weakening, fevered whisper in some forgotten ditch. And in that silence, broken only by the shuffle of weary feet or a rasping cough, another unseen force would begin to stir, not disease this time, but something just as potent, whispers. These whispers, carried on the damp night air or in the dusty haze of the marching column, were the lifeblood of information, however tainted, however unreliable. Official dispatches, when they eventually filtered down through the ranks, were often weeks old, carefully curated stories of grand victories, rarely mentioning the true cost or the grimmer realities you might be experiencing firsthand. The Bulletin de la Grande Armée asterisk might paint a picture of inevitable triumph, but it wouldn't tell you if the bread wagons were truly lost, or if the shadows on the distant horizon were indeed Cossacks sharpening their sabers. So, in the vast echoing absence of reliable truth, rumor became king. It traveled on the wind, a contagion of its own, passed from century to century, from one shivering huddle around a meager fire to the next. A corporal might have heard from a sergeant, who'd gleaned something from an adjutant's batman, who'd perhaps overheard a fragment of an officer's hushed conversation, each layer adding its own embroidery to the original thread. These phantom tales could inflate a minor skirmish into a glorious, decisive battle, or a distant patrol into an imminent, overwhelming attack. Hopes for peace, for a return home, would bloom from the most tenuous of threads. A captured enemy letter, a glimpse of an unfamiliar uniform, the emperor seen smiling, or, more ominously, frowning. Each piece of news, true or false, was precious, hoarded and dissected, embellished with each retelling until its original form was often lost. The truth, like a canteen of clean water on a scorched battlefield, was a rare and precious commodity. What you mostly drank from was the muddy stream of speculation, each sip clouding judgment, stirring fresh anxieties or offering a brief, intoxicating taste of false hope. And so the army stumbled on, not just on its stomach, but on the stories it told itself, a narrative constantly rewritten in the uncertain twilight of the campaign. As the army stumbled on, pushing deeper into these unfamiliar landscapes, the stories you told yourselves around the campfire soon met the stark reality of foreign faces. Beyond the comforting, grimy familiarity of your own ranks, each new horizon brought you into contact with the locals, the people whose lands you now trod, often uninvited. Their world, suddenly intersected by yours, rarely offered a straightforward welcome. Imagine, if you will, marching into a village. Perhaps the air is still, too still, the usual clatter of daily life strangely absent. Shutters are drawn tight, like eyelids squeezed shut against an unwelcome sight. From behind a curtain, you might catch the briefest flicker of a face, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something harder to name, perhaps a deep, simmering resentment. These were the silent greetings, common enough, a heavy cloak of suspicion draped over everything. Sometimes, necessity or a flicker of boldness on either side would lead to tentative interaction. A nervous farmer might offer a few withered vegetables from a meager store, his eyes darting between your worn uniform and the unfamiliar coins in your hand. Perhaps a child, braver than its parents, would stare openly, a tiny, unblinking judge of your presence. These moments of cautious trade, or even just shared human curiosity, were fleeting, like winter sunlight. You might offer a brass button for a sip of local wine, the taste unfamiliar, earthy, a brief distraction from the stale water in your canteen, or the gnawing emptiness in your belly. More often, however, the welcome was a cold wind. The language barrier was a chasm, every unfamiliar syllable a reminder of your alien presence. You'd see the tension and the clenching of a jaw, the quick withdrawal of a hand, the way a mother would pull her child closer as your shadow fell near. These lands had seen armies before, and they knew what marching boots often brought: requisitioned food, commandeered shelter, and the casual, brutal disruption of lives carefully pieced together. The generosity you craved was often replaced by a wary vigilance, or worse, a hostility that might manifest in a sabotaged well, or a misleading direction offered with a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. It was a constant, quiet battle of wills, fought not with muskets but with glances and gestures in the strange, unsettling theater of occupied territory. But those uneasy encounters with the local populace, those silent struggles for a crust of bread or a dry place to sleep, would soon fade into a different kind of quiet. A new tension began to thread itself through the marching columns. A subtle shift in the air that every veteran, and even the greenest recruit, could feel deep in their bones. The casual chatter that usually filled the long miles, the bawdy songs and grumbles about the rations, these would gradually subside, replaced by a more focused silence. This new quiet was punctuated only by the rhythmic tramp of thousands of boots on the packed earth and the metallic jingle of equipment, sounds that now seemed to carry a heavier, more ominous weight. You might find yourself unconsciously checking your musket for the 10th time, ensuring the flint was secure, the powder dry, even though you'd done so only an hour before. It wasn't just about meticulous preparation. It was a ritual, a small act of control in the face of the immense looming unknown that lay just over the horizon. Officers would ride along the lines with a new intensity in their gaze, their orders more clipped, their maps consulted with a frequency that spoke volumes without uttering a word. Scouts, once boisterous, might return with grim, dust-streaked faces, their reports delivered in hushed tones that never quite reached your ears, yet their somber demeanor was message enough. Perhaps, carried on a sudden chill breeze, you'd catch the faintest, most distant whisper. Was that thunder, rumbling in the hills, or the far-off, hungry growl of artillery? Your stomach might tighten, a cold knot forming where breakfast, meager as it was, had once sat. The bravado of the barracks, the abstract glory of the emperor, these grand notions receded. What remained was a starker reality. The man marching beside you, the familiar, worn feel of the musket in your hand, and the gnawing question of what the dawn, or the next tree line might reveal. The world shrank to these immediate sensations, a quiet hum of nervous energy replacing the dull ache of the road as the shadow of the battlefield crept closer. And as that shadow of the battlefield crept closer, a different kind of quiet would settle over the ranks, distinct from the weary silence of the long march. This was the hush of individual preparation, of small, deliberate actions becoming profound. You might find yourself, in the damp, chill air of dawn, going through these motions almost automatically. Your hands, perhaps still stiff from the cold or the lingering ache of yesterday's toil, would move with a practiced, almost reverent care over your Charleville musket. Its familiar, reassuring weight in your grip, a stark contrast to the lightness in your stomach. The metallic tang of gun oil, sharp and familiar, would cut through the scent of damp wool and earth as you meticulously worked the cleaning rod down the barrel. Each scrape and twist a tiny, personal ritual against the vast, encroaching unknown, dislodging any unseen fouling, ensuring a clear path for the shot to come. You'd check the flint, feeling its sharp edge with a calloused thumb, making sure it sat just so, ready to spark life into the weapon. A misfire, a moment's hesitation caused by faulty equipment, could mean everything. Your fingers, fumbling slightly in their eagerness or anxiety, would then find the stiff paper cartridges in their leather box. Each one a little parcel of compact fury, a heavy lead ball, a precise measure of black powder, all neatly wrapped. You'd count them, a silent, tangible reassurance. And perhaps, if a quiet moment could be stolen, away from the watchful eyes of the NCOs, you'd pull out a creased, much-folded scrap of paper, a few hasty words scribbled with a blunt nub of charcoal, a name, a town, a whispered hope, a message to a world you prayed you'd see again. Or maybe just a silent prayer, a personal bargain struck with whatever unseen power might be listening in the thin gray light of a day that promised so much and threatened even more. That quiet moment, however brief, would soon be shattered. At first, it might be a tremor in the earth, a faint vibration felt more than heard, like the distant pulse of some colossal slumbering beast. Then, the sound itself would arrive, a low, guttural growl on the horizon. Artillery. Not close enough to be an immediate personal threat, but a promise. A deep, rolling thunder that spoke of industry and iron, and a terrible, impersonal violence waiting to be unleashed. Each rumble was a punctuation mark in the day's grim sentence. Closer, the air would begin to stir with more distinct noises, the sharp, clipped commands of officers, their voices cutting through the morning mist, trying to impose order on the growing unease. You'd hear the rhythmic thud of thousands of boots on damp earth, the metallic clatter and scrape of bayonets against scabbards, the creak of leather harnesses, the jingle of canteens. Whole regiments, vast rivers of blue and white, were shifting, flowing into their designated places on a chessboard of unimaginable scale. Each sound was a small piece of a much larger, more terrifying machine gearing up. Beneath this symphony of martial preparation, a softer, more human soundscape would emerge. The low murmur of voices, not the boisterous camaraderie of the camp, but hushed, nervous exchanges. A shared joke, perhaps, with a little too much desperation in the laughter. A muttered prayer, a quick, reassuring pat on a comrade's shoulder. The air itself would feel thick, charged with anticipation, a strange cocktail of dread and a grim sort of duty. The overture was playing, and soon the curtain would rise on a stage no one truly wished to see. And then, after the cacophony of preparation, a strange, heavy stillness would descend upon the ranks. Not true silence, of course. The wind, perhaps, still sighed through the tall grass, carrying with it the faint, metallic scent of distant smoke or the earthy smell of damp ground underfoot. You might hear the soft jingle of a bridle, the creak of leather as a nearby comrade shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, a nervous cough quickly suppressed. But the grand, noisy symphony of war gearing up would fade, replaced by an almost unbearable, suspended quiet. This, truly, was the longest wait. Your world would shrink to the space immediately around you. The rough wool of your uniform, Suddenly too warm or perhaps chillingly damp against your skin from the morning dew or your own perspiration. The heavy, familiar weight of your musket, its cold steel a stark contrast to your sweating palms, gripped perhaps a little too tightly. You might feel your own heart, a frantic drummer against your ribs, a wild rhythm trying to break through the forced composure of the line. You wouldn't be talking much now, not really. The earlier nervous jokes would have died on the lips, replaced by fixed gazes, eyes scanning the middle distance where the enemy waited, often just a blur of indistinct color and movement on the horizon. Time itself would seem to warp, stretching mere minutes into agonizing eternities. You'd watch the officers, their faces often inscrutable masks, pacing slowly before their men or standing like statues, their own tension palpable beneath their professional veneer. Every muscle in your body would ache from the effort of remaining still, of embodying that perfect drilled discipline that was the backbone of Napoleon's Grande Armée. It was a profound test, this waiting, a battle fought entirely within yourself, against the rising tide of fear, the gnawing anxiety, and the primal urge to simply do something, anything, to break the spell. But you'd hold. You had to. The order, when it finally came, would be a release of sorts, terrible as its implications might be. Then, the word. A ripple, a command shouted down the line, and the immense, coiled spring of the army finally unlatches. It isn't a gentle awakening, it's a detonation. A single, unified roar erupts from thousands of throats. Vive l'empereur! The sound is colossal, a physical force that seems to buffet the air itself. Your own cry is swallowed by the torrent, a tiny drop in an ocean of sound, yet it joins, it adds, it part of that wave. Instantly, the static world shatters. You're moving, a sudden lurch forward with thousands of others. The ground trembles beneath the impact of countless boots. A rhythmic, thunderous pulse that vibrates up through your worn-out soles and into your very bones. The air, still thick with the smell of damp wool, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of nervous anticipation, now carries the growing scent of churned earth. You might feel a strange lightness, a dizzying rush as adrenaline floods your system, pushing aside the cold dread of moments before, replacing it with a raw, almost feral energy. Fear doesn't vanish. It simply changes its flavor, becoming a sharp, metallic tang at the back of your throat, a frantic companion to the surge of the charge. The world narrows to the backs of the men in front of you, the glint of bayonets, and the distant hazy line you are all hurtling towards. And then the sound truly arrives. It's not a single noise, but an unholy orchestra, tuning up all at once. First, the crackling fire of distant skirmishers, like dry branches snapping in a vast bonfire, sharp and irregular. But as your line advances, that crackle swells, joined by the closer rolling volleys from the enemy line, a monstrous tearing sound, like giant canvas ripping apart, endlessly. This isn't just heard, it's felt. A pressure wave against your chest, a constant, violent drumbeat against your eardrums. Soon, the deeper, guttural roar of the cannons joins the cacophony. Each blast is a physical blow, the ground trembling beneath your worn boots, the air itself vibrating with a monstrous energy. You might see the muzzle flashes, orange and red against the growing haze, brief, terrible suns winking into existence before being swallowed by smoke. The acrid, biting smell of burnt gunpowder, a sulphurous cloud, begins to fill your nostrils, stinging your eyes, catching at the back of your throat. It's a taste as much as a smell, metallic and foul, the perfume of industrialized slaughter. Amidst this mechanical thunder, human voices struggle to be heard. Shouts of officers, barely audible over the sustained roar. The screams of the wounded, sharp and piercing, cutting through the din for a heartbreaking moment before being lost again. The percussive rattle of thousands of feet, the dull thump of falling bodies, the clatter of dropped muskets. All of it starts to merge into one overwhelming, continuous roar. Visibility shrinks as the smoke billows, a thick, choking blanket settling over the field, turning the vibrant colors of uniforms into ghostly shapes, transforming comrades into fleeting glimpses within a gray-white wall. This is the symphony of destruction, a relentless assault on every sense. There's no quiet corner, no moment of peace, just an endless, deafening, disorienting tide of noise and smoke. It's a world reduced to concussive force and blinding, acrid clouds, where the very air seems to shriek. You are a tiny cog in this terrible machine, a single voice attempting to cry out, lost in a choir of utter chaos. And so, lost within that deafening choir, your world begins to shrink. It contracts, doesn't it? Down to the few square feet of churned mud and trampled grass beneath your worn-out boots, to the suffocating press of bodies around you. The grand designs of emperors and generals, those sweeping maneuvers discussed in confident tones far from the front, simply evaporate here, lost in the stinging, acrid haze of gunpowder. They become meaningless whispers against the roar of cannons and the percussive thud of musket volleys that seem to shake the very air you gasp for. Your vision narrows to a terrifying tunnel. Ahead, perhaps, a fleeting glimpse of an enemy uniform, a flash of steel, or just more smoke, impenetrable and disorienting. To your sides, the grimy, sweat-streaked faces of your comrades are the only anchors in this swirling, violent sea. Their presence, the shared tremor of fear and adrenaline, becomes your whole world. You might catch a shouted order, a fragment of a command, often distorted by the din or passed down the line in a desperate, garbled chain. More often, you react. You follow the man next to you. You load. You fire. You try to stand your ground. This isn't a chess game of neat lines and calculated moves. Not for you. It's a maelstrom, a visceral, terrifying blur of sound, flashes of horrific color, and the constant metallic taste of fear in your dry mouth. The ground itself feels alive, trembling with each impact, each fallen man. Survival in this moment is not about heroism as poets might later describe it. It's about instinct, about the desperate, animalistic drive to simply endure the next minute, the next shattering blast, hoping the storm will somehow pass you by. But sometimes, the storm doesn't pass you by. Sometimes, it crashes right into you. The order comes, a hoarse shout swallowed by the din, to advance, or perhaps the enemy line simply lurches forward, a ragged wave of grimacing faces and leveled steel. The world narrows then, doesn't it? All those grand strategies, the sweeping maneuvers of generals, they shrink to the few feet of churned mud between you and the man opposite. His eyes, wide and perhaps just as terrified as your own, become your entire universe. Your musket, once a tool for distant death, now feels cumbersome. Its bayonet a clumsy, elongated tooth. There's no finesse here, no graceful duel of blades. It's a shoving match, a brutal dance where a slip means cold steel in your gut. You thrust, parry with the barrel, grunt with the effort. If the bayonet breaks, or the space is too tight, the heavy wooden stock of your musket becomes a club, a desperate, bludgeoning instrument. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, gun smoke, and something metallic and sickeningly sweet. The unmistakable scent of blood. Every gasp for breath is a victory, every clumsy block a reprieve. This isn't soldiering as you imagined it, polished buttons and crisp formations. This is a desperate scramble, a primal struggle where training gives way to raw instinct, and survival often feels like a cruel lottery. You push, you strain, you see things you'll try desperately to forget. And then, if you are very, very fortunate, a whistle blows, a horn sounds, or the pressure simply lessens, as one side or the other recoils, leaving you panting, slick with grime, and staring at the human cost of those few terrible minutes. But the brief, shuddering quiet that settles after the melee is a deceitful calm. Your ears, still ringing from the clash of steel and the screams, might strain for the next command, the next surge. Instead, a different sound begins to intrude upon the ragged silence. It's a low, guttural rumble from across the churned earth, a vibration you feel more in your bones than hear with your ears at first. Then, the smoke. Great plumes of acrid gray-white smoke begin to blossom in the distance, obscuring the horizon like a malevolent fog, tasting metallic and bitter at the back of your throat. This is when the great guns speak, their voices far louder, far more imperious than any human commander. You might glimpse them, Monstrous dark shapes attended by frantic smoke-smudged figures, their muzzles briefly illuminated by an orange flash. A fleeting, terrible beauty against the grim canvas of war. A heartbeat of silence follows, a dreadful held breath across the battlefield that seems to stretch for an eternity. Then the roar. A physical concussion that thuds against your chest, making the very ground beneath your worn boots tremble. The air above rips with an unholy shriek as the first projectiles arc towards your comrades. Towards you. There's a terrifying impersonality to it all. These iron spheres, these exploding shells filled with jagged shrapnel, are not aimed at *U specifically, not with personal malice. They are aimed at the dense formations, at the abstract idea of the enemy line. A solid round shot, weighing many pounds, might bounce gruesomely across the field. A monstrous black ball playing a deadly game of skittles with human lives, carving grotesque lanes through tightly packed ranks. Or perhaps it's canister, a shotgun blast on a colossal scale, spewing hundreds of smaller iron balls with a horrifying whoosh. Men you stood beside, men whose names you might never have learned, simply disappear, or fall in attitudes of impossible agony. There is no parry, no desperate block this time. Just the sudden, brutal arithmetic of physics and flesh. And then, as abruptly as the storm of iron and lead descended, it stops. The monstrous symphony of war falls silent. What replaces the roar is a quiet so profound, so utterly complete, it feels almost unnatural, pressing down upon the blood-soaked earth like a heavy shroud. Your own breathing might sound deafening in this sudden stillness, your ears still humming with the phantom percussion of cannon fire and the shrieks of shot. The acrid scent of burnt gunpowder hangs thick in the air, a bitter perfume mingling with the coppery tang of what was, moments ago, living men. Slowly, as the gray veils of smoke begin to drift and dissipate, like mournful spirits departing the scene, new sounds emerge from the eerie calm. These are not the impersonal blasts of artillery or the crackle of musketry. These are sounds far more personal, far more chilling. The low moans of the wounded begin to punctuate the silence, a scattered chorus of suffering. A desperate cry for "Maman," a gurgled plea for water, the soft, repetitive whimpers of a man bargaining with a god he perhaps hadn't thought of since childhood. You might see movement in the twilight, a figure struggling to rise, another feebly waving a hand. The grand, terrible theater of battle has closed its curtains, and now the stage is littered with its tragic players. This quiet isn't peace. It's a breathless, agonizing pause, heavy with the thousands of tiny, private tragedies unfolding across the darkened field. It's the sound of an immense bill coming due, tallied in human lives under a sky that is slowly, inexorably, pricking through with cold, indifferent stars. The stars offer little comfort, mere pinpricks of distant, indifferent light on a scene of profound darkness. Now, with the deafening roar of cannons finally silenced, replaced by an aching, almost breathing quiet, the true work begins. You and your remaining tent mates, those still able to push past the bone-deep weariness, would venture out. Perhaps one of you carries a sputtering tallow lamp, its feeble light casting long, dancing shadows that make the fallen seem to writhe, or you simply trust your eyes to adjust to the deepening gloom. Each step onto that churned, blood-soaked earth is heavy, not just with fatigue, but with a grim, heart-heavy anticipation. You're scanning the countless mounds, searching for a familiar epaulette, the specific way a comrade slouched even in rest, the glint of a cherished battered tin cup. The air, thick with the metallic tang of shed blood and the acrid memory of spent gunpowder, carries sounds that tear at the fragile silence. A low, almost animalistic groan here, a softly muttered prayer or a name carried on the breeze there. You call out, your own voice sounding strange and hollow in the vast emptiness. Antoine? Jean-Luc? Hoping against hope for a response that isn't just the rustle of disturbed grass or the sigh of the night wind. Finding a friend alive, perhaps grievously wounded but undeniably breathing, is a small, fierce spark of warmth in the overwhelming, numbing cold of loss. But more often, the discovery is a silent, brutal confirmation. A face you shared stale bread and whispered jokes with only hours ago. now still and waxen in the mud, eyes staring blankly at those same uncaring stars. There's no grand eulogy out here, just a profound tightening in your chest, a shared hollow glance with another searcher, a silent acknowledgement of another irreplaceable gap in your thinning, tattered ranks. This somber, informal roll call taken amongst the dead and the dying etched itself onto the soul far deeper than any official muster, a tally of absence that would echo for years to come. The echoes of that silent muster fade, replaced by a sound far more immediate, far more visceral. It's a low, rolling wave of human suffering, a symphony of groans, pleas, and whimpers that rises from the darkened field. Thousands lie scattered, a terrible harvest reaped by ball and blade. Imagine, if you can bear it, the chilling dampness of the earth seeping into your torn uniform, the air thick with the coppery scent of blood and the acrid residue of gunpowder, a grim perfume clinging to everything. The injuries are a brutal testament to the day's ferocity. A musket ball, seemingly so small, could inflict horrific damage, splintering bone with a sickening crack, or carving a searing burning path through muscle and sinew. Then there were the cannonballs, those crude, devastating iron spheres that didn't so much wound as obliterate, leaving behind a nightmarish tableau that defied easy description. Saber cuts, too, inflicted their own brand of agony, deep gashes that bled profusely, chilling the body as life seeped away into the indifferent, thirsty mud. For these men, the battle might be over, but a new, far more personal struggle had just begun. The desperate, agonizing wait for aid. Surgeons, themselves overwhelmed and exhausted, moved like phantoms through this sea of pain, their lanterns casting flickering, insufficient light on the sheer scale of the carnage. The chances of survival often felt cruelly random, dependent on the nature of the wound, your proximity to the desperately limited medical care, or simply your own fading strength against the encroaching cold and shock. Many would find their final rest here, beneath those same uncaring stars, their unheard cries absorbed by the silent earth, their stories abruptly, brutally unfinished. And if you were one of the lucky ones, dragged or stumbling towards a flickering light in the oppressive darkness, you might find yourself approaching the surgeon's tent. From a distance it's a beacon, however faint, against the encroaching despair. But as you draw nearer, the sounds begin to curdle the air. Not the sharp crack of musketry now, but something more intimate, more human in its suffering. Low moans, a stifled scream cut short, the rhythmic, chilling rasp of a saw against bone. A sound that seemed to vibrate deep within your own chest. Step inside, if you dare, into this canvas haven of last resort. The air is thick, heavy with the metallic tang of blood, the sourness of unwashed bodies, and perhaps the faint, sharp scent of wine or brandy, used more to fortify the surgeon's nerves or to attempt a crude cleansing of a wound than for any real antiseptic properties. Lantern light throws grotesque, dancing shadows on the tent walls, illuminating a scene of swift, grim purpose. Surgeons, their aprons stiff with dried gore, their faces etched with exhaustion and a profound weariness, work with a desperate efficiency. Their tools are few and terrifyingly simple, laid out on a rough, perhaps blood-stained cloth. A gleam of polished steel from a bone saw, probes for exploring the depths of a wound, heavy needles threaded with coarse gut, and an array of curved knives, each with its own dreadful specialty. There is no gentle drift into unconsciousness here, no merciful anesthesia to dull the torment that awaits. Every cut, every extraction of a musket ball, every agonizing amputation is felt with excruciating, unforgettable clarity. Yet amidst this theater of pain, the surgeon's tent also held a desperate, fragile sliver of hope. For many grievously wounded soldiers, this brutal, rudimentary care, delivered by men pushed to their absolute limits, was the only barrier standing between them and a slow, agonizing death from infection or exsanguination. It was a terrible gamble in a world where choices were few and often cruel, a place where a life might be saved but at a cost etched into flesh and memory. But even the most skilled or perhaps luckiest surgeon could not cheat death indefinitely. For every soldier who limped away from that tent, scarred but alive, many others would draw their last ragged breath on the blood-soaked ground or within the crowded, desperate aid stations. And then came the aftermath, a task even more somber than the surgeon's bloody work. The battlefield, once a cacophony of cannon fire and human cries, would fall into an uneasy quiet, punctuated only by the groans of the dying and, soon, the grim sounds of the burial details. Imagine the air, heavy with the metallic tang of spent powder and something far sweeter, far more sickening, the scent of the unburied. Soldiers, weary to their bones, would be assigned this Herculean, heartbreaking task. Their duty, to gather the fallen, to clear the ravaged landscape of its human debris. There was rarely time or space for individual graves, for tender ceremony. Friend and foe, indistinguishable now in the stillness of death, often shared the same final resting place, vast, hastily dug pits. Uniforms, once vibrant with regimental colors, were now stained with mud and life's crimson, their wearers tumbled in, shoulder to shoulder, a silent testament to the battle's brutal arithmetic. You might see a hand reaching out, as if for a final grasp, or a face turned towards a sky it could no longer see. The work was heavy, the earth cold and unforgiving, and each spadeful felt like a final weary farewell to comrades, and to enemies who were, in the end, just men. It was a stark, unceremonious end, a blunt punctuation mark to so many young lives. This grim accounting, repeated after every major engagement, served as a constant, chilling reminder of the true cost of glory, a cost paid in flesh and blood, and buried, unceremoniously, far from home, beneath a soil that knew no allegiance. Once the earth had claimed its due, and the last spadeful had fallen, a different kind of work began, often under the cloak of twilight or a reluctant dawn. The battlefield, still echoing with the profound silence of the departed, transformed. It became a vast, open-air emporium of the macabre, picked over by those still drawing breath. This wasn't the frenzied looting that sometimes occurred in the heat of battle. This was a slower, more methodical, and infinitely more desperate crawl. A gleaning, as it was sometimes grimly, quietly called. Imagine yourself there, one of the survivors, the adrenaline long since drained, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. The ground beneath your worn-out boots is still damp, churned, and littered with the detritus of violent collapse. You might stoop, your back aching, to inspect a discarded musket. Perhaps its lock mechanism is still good, a valuable spare. Or you run your fingers over a stiffened leather satchel, hoping for a forgotten letter, a map, or even a half-eaten biscuit. The air is a heavy cocktail. The sharp, metallic tang of old blood, the pervasive, cloying sweetness of decay just beginning its work, mingled with the acrid scent of gunpowder smoke clinging to the damp earth and sodden wool. What were they searching for, these weary gleaners? Anything, truly. A pair of surprisingly intact boots. A godsend when your own felt like wet paper dissolving around your blistered feet. A thicker greatcoat, perhaps stripped from a fallen grenadier. Warmth, after all, held no allegiance in the biting winds of a European winter night. A stray copper coin, glinting dully in the mud. A tarnished silver button to replace one lost. A waterlogged but potentially life-saving blanket. These weren't the glorious spoils of romantic tales, but the desperate, humble pickings of survivors. Each item found was a small, bitter victory against the encroaching cold, hunger, or further destitution. A tiny weight tipped back towards the simple, brutal act of staying alive for one more day. But staying alive didn't always mean staying free. Sometimes, the bitter lottery of war dealt a different hand. One where the desperate scramble for survival continued, but under a different, far more constrained sky. The small, bitter victories of found sustenance could be snatched away in an instant, replaced by the stark reality of capture. Imagine, then, the world turned upside down. One moment, you are the scavenger, sifting through the aftermath for a scrap of hope, a tarnished button, a half loaf of bread. The next, a rough shout in an unfamiliar tongue. The cold press of enemy steel against your back, and your musket, once an extension of your arm, is wrenched away. Suddenly, Your horizon shrinks to the lice-ridden collar of the man stumbling before you, the indifferent stare of the guard marching alongside. The spoils of war are no longer a blanket or a coin, but merely the breath you still draw, each one a fragile triumph. The journey of a captive was often a slow, shuffling torment. No heroic fanfares here, just the relentless, dreary cadence of boots on mud, the clatter of a dropped mess tin, the rasping coughs that echoed through the weary column. The air itself often felt heavy, thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, stale fear, and the ever-present, invisible threat of typhus or dysentery. You might find yourself trudging for weeks, across barren landscapes or through hostile villages, fueled by scraps of hard bread or a thin, greasy broth that did little to quiet the gnawing ache in your belly. Your gaze, once scanning for opportunity, now fixed on the distant, indifferent horizon or simply the ground beneath your failing feet. And what of the guards overseeing these miserable processions? They, too, were often weary, ill-fed, cogs in the same vast, grinding machine, tasked with herding a tide of human misery. Perhaps a flicker of grim recognition, a shared understanding of exhaustion, passed between captor and captive, a silent acknowledgement of the brutal machine that had ensnared them both, albeit on different sides of the rifle. The future for a prisoner was a vast, murky unknown. Would it be a damp, crowded cell in a forgotten fortress? A long, debilitating wait for a rare exchange? Or simply the cold earth of a mass grave, far from anything familiar? Capture was a chilling reversal of fortune, a plunge into a gray limbo where the only victory was to see another dawn, however bleak. But for those whose colors still flew high as the smoke began to clear, the world transformed in an instant. Victory. The word itself was a balm, a sudden, intoxicating rush that could almost make you forget the gnawing hunger, the aching limbs, the friends who wouldn't be sharing this moment. A wave of sound would wash over the field, not the screams of battle, but a ragged, joyous roar. Muskets, now useless for fighting, might be tossed into the air. Men, caked in mud and blood, would embrace, sharing swigs from a captured brandy flask, its fiery sweetness a stark contrast to the metallic tang of fear that had coated their tongues moments before. The very air, thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, now seemed to carry a hint of relief, of promise. For a night, at least, there might be better food, a drier patch of ground, and the deep, untroubled sleep of the momentarily safe. Defeat, however, was a chilling silence, broken only by the crackle of distant fires from the victor's camp, or the low moans of the unlucky. It was the frantic, stumbling retreat through deepening darkness. The ground slick with more than just mud. Every shadow could be an enemy, every rustle of leaves a prelude to a bayonet. The elation of the enemy became your torment, their cheers echoing across the blood-soaked earth. There was no captured brandy, only the bitter taste of ashes in your mouth, and the cold dread of what the morning or the next pursuing cavalry charge might bring. The camaraderie of victory was replaced by a desperate, isolated struggle, each man a ghost fleeing a nightmare, the weight of the fallen eagle pressing down on every exhausted shoulder. After the raw terror of retreat, the taste of ash still lingering, you might find yourself assigned to garrison duty. A different kind of war, this one fought not with cavalry charges and cannon fire, but with the slow, grinding weight of occupation. Imagine yourself billeted in a subdued town, its cobbled streets echoing with the unfamiliar tramp of your boots. The air, thick with a scent of damp stone and suspicion, hangs heavy. Your days settle into a predictable, almost suffocating rhythm. Hours of guard duty, perhaps atop a chilly stone rampart, the wind whistling a mournful tune as you stare out over unfamiliar rooftops or silent, empty fields. There's endless drilling in the dusty town square, the sun beating down on your patched, often lice-ridden uniform, the shouted commands a familiar monotonous drone, mending worn-out leather straps, polishing your musket until it gleams dully. These are the small, repetitive rituals that fill the vast, empty spaces between one uneventful day and the next. Food is rarely plentiful, often a thin, watery stew, the bread sometimes hard enough to break a tooth. A far cry from the plundered feasts some might have dreamed of. And the locals they watch, their faces are often shuttered, their eyes averted as you pass, conversations in their unfamiliar tongue ceasing abruptly. A polite nod from you might be met with a blank stare. Or worse, a barely concealed flicker of resentment. You are a constant, unwelcome reminder of their subjugation, a foreign body in their ancient streets. It's a quiet, simmering hostility, a tension you can almost taste, like the metallic tang of old blood on the air. This quiet war, too, takes its toll. A slow erosion of spirit, far from the thunder of battle but no less wearing. Sometimes, a distant church bell or the faint sound of children's laughter might drift over the walls, a poignant reminder of a life you barely recall, a peace that feels impossibly distant. The distant church bell, the faint laughter, these are whispers from a world almost forgotten. But then another force, older than any emperor, begins to assert its dominion: winter. The biting winds sweep across the plains, snow begins to dust the landscape, and the very earth hardens underfoot. The relentless rhythm of the march, the constant readiness for battle, finally, grudgingly, yields. Winter quarters are sought, not in grand palaces, but often in commandeered barns, hastily constructed huts, or the crowded rooms of reluctant villagers. The air grows thick with the scent of damp wool, wood smoke, and the simmering, often meager contents of 1,000 cookpots. Here, for a precious few months, there is a different kind of struggle. The enemy is not a line of bayonets, but the gnawing cold, the rampant lice, the boredom that settles like frost. Yet there's also a profound, weary relief. A chance to darn threadbare uniforms, the rough wool coarse under your chilled fingers. To nurse wounds that never quite healed on the march, or to simply sit, sheltered from the relentless elements. Perhaps even to receive a letter from home, a fragile, ink-stained connection to a life far removed, its thin paper smelling faintly of wood smoke from a distant hearth. Supplies, when they arrive, are scrutinized. New flints, perhaps some decent powder, or even the rare luxury of fresh bread instead of another hardtack biscuit. Drills continue, of course, in the frozen mud or crisp snow, the barked commands of sergeants echoing in the thin, cold air. It's a way to keep the rust from settling on men and muskets alike, to maintain some semblance of discipline amidst the enforced idleness. But there's a changed tempo, a slowing. Evenings might find small groups huddled around a flickering fire, sharing stories, a swig of watered-down wine, the air filled with the low murmur of voices and the occasional, rough-edged song. It's a strange, suspended existence, this winter truce. A long collective breath held before the inevitable spring thaws, and the drums, once more, begin their insistent call. But before the drums truly awaken, before the thaws release the armies back onto the muddy stage of war, another, more insidious rhythm often takes hold in those close winter quarters. The enemy here isn't clad in a different colored uniform, nor does he carry a musket or saber. This foe is invisible, insidious, carried on the breath, in the stale water, or by the smallest, most persistent of unwelcome guests. Imagine, if you will, squeezing into a cramped barn, a requisitioned farmhouse, or a hastily constructed hut alongside dozens, sometimes hundreds, of your comrades. The air grows thick and heavy, a potent cocktail of unwashed bodies, damp wool, acrid smoke from a poorly vented fire, and the faint, cloyingly sweet aroma of sickness already taking root. Straw bedding, if you're lucky enough to have it, quickly becomes a shared, rustling haven for lice. The emperor's new recruits, as some might grimly jest, tireless carriers of what was often simply and ominously called camp fever, typhus, dysentery, influenza. These fevers, and others like them, would sweep through the tightly packed lodgings with a terrifying, silent efficiency. One man starts to shiver uncontrollably, his skin hot and dry to the touch, his eyes glazed, and soon, the men huddled beside him for warmth might begin their own descent. There's precious little to be done. The surgeons, already overwhelmed and often ill-equipped for such pervasive illnesses, could offer scant comfort against these invisible legions. It was a grim lottery, really, whether the winter's biting chill or the fever's consuming fire would claim you before the spring campaign even began. So even as the snows pile high outside, blanketing the landscape in a deceptive peace, the true battle for many a soldier is fought not against a human adversary, but against the creeping, unseen tendrils of disease. A silent, inglorious war waged in the fetid air and shared misery of their supposed sanctuary, thinning the ranks just as surely and far less heroically than any cannonade. Yet, even in such bleak surroundings where the specter of sickness loomed larger than any distant general, a flicker of a different kind could pierce the gloom. It wasn't the promise of battle or glory, but something far more personal, far more vital to the soul. News from home. The arrival of the mail, an infrequent and precious event, could transform the mood of a regiment, sending ripples of quiet anticipation through the weary ranks. A name might be called out, low and resonant in the chill air, and a rough, calloused hand would reach for a thin, folded piece of paper that had traveled countless miles, passed through innumerable hands, a tiny emissary from a forgotten peace. Imagine, if you will, the soldier retreating to a quiet corner, if such a thing truly existed amidst the crush of bodies and the pervasive damp. He unfolds that fragile link to a world he'd left behind, the paper perhaps creased and softened by its journey, bearing the almost imagined scent of his village. A hint of baking bread, or the damp earth of his own fields after a spring rain. Each carefully penned line, or sometimes a lovingly drawn, smudged picture from a child, was a lifeline. News of births, deaths, harvests, and the small, ordinary happenings of a life that now seemed an impossibly distant dream, read by the dim light filtering into a tent, or the weak glow of a shared fire. And for those who possessed the skill of letters, or could persuade a more learned comrade to assist, the act of replying was a profound undertaking. With a precious stub of charcoal, or a painstakingly sharpened quill dipped in makeshift ink, perhaps soot patiently mixed with a little water or wine, they would laboriously scrawl their own messages onto whatever scrap of paper could be found. Reassurances of their well-being, often carefully omitting the true grinding horrors of their daily existence, alongside desperate inquiries about their loved ones. These scraps of paper, exchanged across a war-torn continent, were more than just words. They were threads of humanity, fragile filaments stitching together hearts separated by the vast, uncaring machinery of conflict. And among those who endured, who perhaps wrote those very letters with calloused, ink-stained fingers, were a special breed, a distinct silhouette against the smoky backdrop of war. They were the grognards, Napoleon's legendary old guard. The name itself, the grumblers, affectionately bestowed, paints a rather vivid picture, doesn't it? These were not fresh-faced boys, eyes wide with the promise of their first taste of glory. No, these were the grizzled veterans, men whose skin was leathered by 100 suns, and whose joints ached from a dozen bitter winters spent in the emperor's demanding service. Their tall bearskin hats, symbols of their elite status, might be battered, their once fine blue greatcoats faded from relentless sun and drenching rain, bearing the silent testimony of countless campaigns. Their faces, often framed by formidable mustaches, were etched with lines that told stories more profound than any written page. You could almost hear the constant low hum of their complaints, a chorus that followed the army like its own shadow, about the dwindling rations, the bone-chilling damp, the endless, soul-wearying marching, or the questionable sanity of the latest orders from on high. They'd grumble about the thick mud that clung like a greedy beast to their worn boots, the watery thinness of the evening soup, or even the way a new, untested officer parted his hair. Yet let the drums beat the pas de charge. Let the diminutive figure of the emperor himself appear, his gaze sweeping over them, and these same grumblers would transform. Their muttered dissatisfactions would fall silent, instantly replaced by a grim, almost sacred determination, a steely resolve glinting in their experienced eyes. They were the bedrock, the immovable, often profane core of the Grande Armée. They might complain all the way to the cannon's very mouth, but they would go, their loyalty to him a bond forged in shared hardship and victory, as elemental as the air they breathed. And go they did, time and time again, into the storm of iron and fire. But what became of those who walked out of that storm marked by its fury? For many, the return to a world no longer attuned to the drumbeat of war was a battle in itself, fought in the quiet corners of their minds and the aching landscapes of their bodies. The price of glory, so often celebrated in grand paintings and stirring tales, was etched deeply onto these men, a ledger of suffering paid long after the cannons fell silent. Imagine, if you will, encountering such a veteran years later, perhaps begging on a Parisian street corner, his old uniform faded and patched, or quietly tending a small, unyielding patch of land far from the grand avenues. You might notice the sleeve neatly pinned up where an arm once was, a constant reminder of a surgeon's hurried, desperate work amidst the mud and screams. Or perhaps a deep, puckered scar across a face, a stark white line against weathered skin, a souvenir from a cavalry saber's cruel kiss, forever altering a smile or pulling at an eyelid. These were the more obvious tolls, the visible receipts for their service, badges of survival worn with a quiet, weary dignity. But beneath the threadbare coat, or the civilian clothes that never quite seemed to fit right again, lay other wounds. The kind that didn't bleed, but ached with a chilling persistence, gnawing at the soul in the dead of night. The sudden, involuntary flinch at a slamming door, mistaken for distant cannon fire. The long, restless nights spent staring into the darkness, replaying scenes of unimaginable carnage, the ghostly faces of fallen comrades swimming before their tired eyes. Glory was a demanding mistress, and her price was often paid in painful installments, long after the victory parades had faded into silence. For these survivors, the war never truly ended. It simply found new, quieter battlefields within their own minds, a lingering, melancholic echo of the Emperor's grand designs. And so, for a fortunate few, the campaigns did eventually draw to a close. Not always with a grand pronouncement, but perhaps with the quiet finality of a scribbled name on a discharge list, a last, meager payment pressed into a calloused palm. The journey homeward was often another campaign in itself, a solitary trek across a landscape perhaps still tender from conflict. Or, jarringly, one that seemed utterly untouched by the horrors etched into your own mind. Imagine, if you will, the slow unraveling of miles, the phantom sensation of the heavy musket no longer slung across your shoulder, the distant, imagined rhythm of the marching drums fading to a faint, irregular pulse in your ears. You arrive, at long last, to a place you once called home. The air itself might feel different, thinner somehow, less thick with the metallic tang of gunpowder and the heavy scent of unwashed bodies, and more of damp earth after rain, or perhaps the sweet, forgotten aroma of baking bread drifting from a neighbor's hearth. But the faces are undeniably older. The children you barely remember are now young men and women, their lives spun from threads you haven't touched. The familiar threshold of your cottage door might seem lower, the rooms smaller. Or is it you who has been irrevocably altered, shaped by experiences that create a chasm between you and these peaceful souls? They greet you, of course, with tears and hesitant embraces, yet a subtle, unspoken distance often lingers. How do you translate the raw, visceral terror of a cavalry charge, when their greatest recent drama was a rained-out village festival? The simple, steady rhythms of civilian life, the clatter of tools, the gentle lowing of cattle at dusk, can feel alien, a melody played in a key you no longer fully comprehend. The profound silence of the nights, unbroken by the cries of the wounded or the sudden alarm of a sentry, could paradoxically be as deafening, as unsettling, as any cannonade. Rejoining this quiet world was its own kind of battle, fought not with bayonet and saber, but with a heart heavy with memory, and a spirit struggling to find its old moorings. Returning then wasn't merely a physical journey across muddy roads or dusty plains. It was an attempt to bridge an immense, silent chasm within. The familiar, comforting scent of baking bread wafting from the village oven, a smell that once signified nothing but simple sustenance and home, now might carry the faint, phantom tang of gunpowder smoke, a cruel olfactory trick of a mind forever altered. The joyful, uncomplicated laughter of children playing in the sun-dappled lane, so utterly carefree, could, for a fleeting moment, echo with the remembered cries of fallen comrades, a sound that settled deep in the bones. You had witnessed a world remade by fire, ambition, and the relentless march of armies, and in turn, you, the individual soldier, were remade too. The once abstract concepts of la patrie of France, the grand pronouncements of emperors and generals, were no longer distant words from a proclamation read aloud in the town square. They had solidified, taken visceral form. They were the grim, determined faces of your fellow soldiers. Huddled close around a sputtering, smoky campfire on a freezing night, sharing a biscuit hard as stone or a sliver of tough, stringy meat. They were the tattered, shot-through, yet still glorious eagles you had sworn an oath to defend, even as your stomach gnawed with a persistent hollow hunger and your feet, wrapped in rags, bled into the soles of your worn-out boots. This transformation wasn't always a glorious ascent to heroism. Often, it was simply a necessary hardening, a dulling of certain sensitivities to survive the unimaginable, and an unwelcome permanent sharpening of others. The grand pronouncements of leaders, the adulation of distant crowds, these could now ring hollow, a discordant note against the stark, visceral reality of what you'd seen, what you'd done, what you'd endured. The world back home continued its familiar rhythm, but you carried other, harsher worlds within you now. The sun-baked, arid plains of Spain, the bone-chilling, frozen rivers of Russia, the terrified, wide eyes of an enemy, seen for a fraction of a second before the final, brutal clash. These were not memories to be shared easily over a tankard of ale in the local tavern. They were etchings on the soul, a new and perhaps inevitably heavier lens through which all of life, all of its quiet moments and its sudden storms would now be viewed. And so the individual soldier faded back into the tapestry of ordinary life, or perhaps never truly left the shadows of the battlefield. But multiply that single, heavy heart by hundreds of thousands. Imagine the sheer weight of those experiences, rippling out across Europe, carried in the stoop of a shoulder, the faraway look in an eye, the stories whispered only in the deepest hours of the night, or perhaps never spoken at all. These men, the backbone of the Grande Armée, carried more than just their muskets and their meager rations. They carried the weight of an era on their weary shoulders. So many names lost to the winds, like smoke from a dying campfire on a forgotten battlefield. Jean-Pierre, Antoine, Friedrich, Ivan, farmers, blacksmiths, bakers, boys barely old enough to shave, all swept up in the grand, terrible machine of war. Their individual bravery, their quiet suffering, their moments of fear and camaraderie, often go unrecorded in the grand annals, which tend to focus on emperors and generals. Yet, it was their boots that trod the endless miles, their hands that bore the heavy Charleville muskets, their bellies that knew the gnawing emptiness of hunger on those long, arduous campaigns across desolate landscapes. Their collective presence, though, still resonates, a faint, persistent echo. It's in the folk songs that recall lost loved ones, sung softly by a fireside generations later. It's in the time-worn letters discovered in dusty attics, the ink faded, the paper fragile, filled with simple longings for home and hearth, for a warm meal, for a moment of peace. It's a quiet hum beneath the louder narratives of victory and defeat. These were the ordinary men who endured the extraordinary, whose countless footsteps carved paths into history, even if their names are now just whispers in the vast, silent fields where they once marched, fought, and dreamed of a life beyond the cannon's roar. And in remembering their small, immense stories, we touch something profoundly human, a truth that echoes long after the drums of war have fallen silent. Thank you for joining us on Plotfall. Until our next story, may your thoughts be calm and your rest deep.